Hello and welcome to another Josh Plays 40k painting tutorial. Today we'll be painting the Barbgaunts from the Leviathan box set as the next installation of this series. And really looking forward to getting these painted up. I actually very sneakily put them into a game unpainted yesterday evening, and they did perform quite well. Their weapons are really good for sort of holding people up, and I do quite enjoy that, and they do look pretty cool as well with the sort of new sort of cannon sort of going over their shoulders. I quite like that design, and yeah, so let's paint one up in as Hive Fleet Leviathan. So without further ado, let's grab some brushes and get started. So first of all, obviously I have built the miniatures and primed this in Wraithbone spray just to give a nice sort of warm undercoat to start with. And the first paint we're going to do is we're going to focus on the purple carapace, which I think is sort of one of the biggest obviously portions of the miniature, and it will take a little bit of obviously neatening afterwards, obviously going around the edges. And for this we're going to use the Leviathan purple contrast paint, and we're just going to pick out all the areas that need to be this purple. So particularly obviously all of the carapace on the miniature. There's obviously quite a bit of obviously armor plating as well, sort of going around. You'll have noticed as well that I have kept the guns separate, and this is just to allow us better access to both the carapace here on this side and the details, as well as actually being able to get the paint on the gun themselves. Now, you don't have to do the sub-assembly if you don't want to. Obviously, if you're happy to paint it as it is, that's fine. But I do find that the sub-assembly on certain miniatures, certainly this one, sort of gives you a nice peace of mind that you've picked out all of the detail that you need to get. So work your way around the model. So obviously, once you've finished the back part here, there is the knee pads to do. Obviously the head crest as well, like almost with like a normal sort of termagant or hormagaunt, and then obviously not forgetting this sort of crest part here, which looks after the brain, which is slightly exposed underneath, if you can see. So there is those parts, and then once you've finished with the main miniature itself, we're then going to come onto the weapon. And I mean, just take a moment to quite admire that design. It is incredibly alien, shall we say. But you've got a few purple details on here. So you've got this whole crest area on the top here, as well as the backstage, and then also just a little bit of armoring down the bottom here. So do take your time. Some of it does sort of meld into the weapon. So down here it does, and obviously here. And again on the other side you've got the same. So the purple will probably be one of the longest steps that it will take you to get this right. And obviously if you do make any mistakes, we can neaten up afterwards. But take your time, work your way around, and then obviously we can move on. Once you've got all that purple carapace applied, we're going to just tidy up the rest of the skin areas that we've accidentally brushed with the purple. And for this we're just going to go back to Wraithbone, and we're just going to quickly neaten up and apply any areas that you may have made a mistake. So for me, I've gone over the sort of head crest here, and I'm just going to neaten that up to give that purple a more sort of defined line, and to obviously leave the skin free of any different sort of globs of paint. So just take your time, work your way around your models, and just pick out any little bits that you didn't mean to do. It's also worth doing whilst you're doing this to recoat the little vents in the backs here. Now I'd recommend doing this with a small fine tip brush and a very steady hand so that you don't obviously mess up the purple. You can obviously try and leave them blank when doing the purple itself. I have managed to do that on a couple of the models that I've done already, but it's not the easiest to miss them, and once you've sort of touch them with the paint, it's sort of easier to go back over them entirely with Wraithbone rather than trying to sort of neaten up afterwards. So as I say, steady hand and a small point brush to recoat those on so that we can obviously then apply the shades afterwards. Once you're happy with that purple and you've tidied up all the skin tones, next thing is to put the shade on the skin. So for this we're going to do a mix of Magos Purple and Contrast Medium, and this is a 3-to-1 mixture. You can do 4-to-1 if you prefer it to be a little bit paler, but that is just personal choice. It does dry quite pale when it's on the model, so it's not too bad, and if you keep it moving and obviously spread it quite thinly anyway onto the model, you will just find it will sit quite nicely in the recesses you want. So this is really just to go all over all of the skin. It doesn't matter if it touches anything that we're going to do in the sort of classic sort of red hoofs and claws, because obviously the red we're going to put on will cover that quite nicely, but sort of work your way around and get a nice sort of even coat on all of those areas. Obviously the only part you don't want to do is the brain on the back, and you don't have to worry about the vents just yet either, because that's going to be a slightly different shade. So yes, obviously you just be able to put this on the model, let it completely dry before moving on to the next step, because we don't want the next shade we apply to sort of run, as that will be a lot darker, and we don't really want the skin to get stained with that. So obviously not forgetting as well to do the hands on the gun itself. So obviously just carefully do the hands and arms that are on the gun, and that way obviously they'll all be in keeping with the rest of the model. Once you're happy with that skin dry, the next thing we're going to do is fill in a little bit more of the details when it comes to the sort of open skin vents, and anywhere we want it to be a slightly sort of darker shade of pink. So for this we're going to use a 1-to-1 mix of Volupus Pink and Contrast Medium, and you're going to want quite a small sort of fine tip brush for this work, and what we're going to do is take a small amount of this onto the brush and just sort of let this run into the sort of recesses of the skin. So these sort of vents in the skin here, very famous obviously for Tyranids models to have this. Obviously sort of any sort of open flesh parts, so at the backs of the legs here, as well as the sort of fronts of the kneecap. So we've got this part here, and that really just sort of starts to bring that together and break the sort of skin up a little bit, so that the lighter skin obviously shows up a lot more, and gives it more sort of definition. So just obviously pick out any of the areas that you want to be this darker skin, obviously not forgetting the vents at the top here into the purple that we coated earlier. Just put a sort of light coat of that over the top of those, obviously not forgetting the other side either. What you can also do with this as well is, if one of your models has an open mouth with a tongue hanging out, you can also coat this over the top of the tongue to give you a nice sort of fleshy tone for that. And obviously not forgetting any open vents on the gun as well. Obviously that would only apply, for me to show you, onto the arms themselves. So again, there's sort of open parts of the flesh here. Obviously not having to worry about any of this part of the weapon, which is obviously going to be red in due course. So take your time, work your way around the model, and when we can move on to the next stage. So the next stage we're going to work on is staying with Volupus Pink, but this time we are going to mix it with a 2-to-1 ratio, so 2 parts Contrast Medium to 1 part Volupus Pink, and this is to sort of coat over the tops of these sort of pipes coming from the brain into the head. So we don't want this to be quite so prominent as the other fleshy areas that we've done, but we do just want to coat these over and make them stand out a little bit more to the rest of the flesh, and obviously give them a little bit more standpoint. So coat that all over, and then let that completely dry before moving on to the next stage. Once you're happy with that second layer of Volupus Pink, we're then going to move on to Flesh Tearers Red, and this is for all the sort of claws and the hoofs of the model. So particularly obviously the feet and the hoofs down the bottom here, any of the claws on the backs, or the claw at the top here on this side, but predominantly this colour is going to be mostly for the weapon. And what we're going to do is you're going to coat the red over all of the areas that are more or less missing at the moment. So the spike down the bottom here, the front, but the parts you're going to want to wait and leave are the bits we're going to make slightly brighter. So we're going to mix some oranges and yellows in there as well at this stage before moving on to highlighting. So the bits you want to miss are all these sort of circular parts. So there's the circle at the big circle in the middle, the smaller ones at the back, and obviously the same on the other side. So be very careful and neat with the red as you go around. Obviously, if you do make any mistakes, you can neaten back up with Wraithbone. That's absolutely fine. And obviously do take great care when going around the hands as well. So I do suggest a smaller brush for this, but do take your time, work your way around, obviously let it completely dry, and then we can move on to adding some other colours. Once you're happy with that red and you've tidied up any mistakes, we can move on to adding a couple bit more details onto the weapon itself. So coming back over to here, we're going to use 2 paints of Grifthound Orange and Iodine Yellow, and these are just to pick out these circle areas. So first of all, we're going to put the Iodine Yellow into the larger socket at the front here, so just sort of putting that in, and this will obviously fare out quite nicely against the red, so obviously keeping it as a warmer tone and giving it that detail, and obviously not forgetting the one on the other side, like so. And then obviously cleaning off your brush and moving on to Grifthound Orange, and we're going to use these for all of the smaller circles on the gun. So this particular one here, and then straight into the smaller one, obviously not forgetting that it will run quite nicely into the recesses, and that looks quite nice and tied in, and just helps break that red up a little bit, and sort of gives the gun a few more sort of focal points of interest. I think obviously if you look at the box art, they do actually colour these orbs differently already, so specifically where the larger yellow one, and once we get some of the red highlights on as well, that's all going to blend in very, very nicely. So let that completely set, and then we can move on to the next stage. Next up, we're going to block in some of those other details on the miniature itself, and for this we're going to use Skeleton Horde, and this is to pick out the teeth on the model. Now obviously some of them will have an open mouth, this one I've got here doesn't, but you just simply get a little bit of this on the brush. Obviously do try not to get it onto the skin tone, but just sort of work your way around the mouth, just sort of letting it fall into the recesses between the teeth. You certainly don't need a lot of this on your brush. You're just looking to obviously put a little bit of stain onto them and make them stand out from the rest of the jaw. Once you're happy with those teeth, we're then going to move on to a 1-to-1 mix of contrast medium and achromatic blue, and this is to pick out the brain detail, and we don't really want it to be too dark. That is why we are mixing it and diluting it down a little bit with the contrast medium. But this does give a really nice sort of brain effect over the top aside, and then helps break it up from the the pinks and the purples. So just sort of take your time to work in that sort of brain detail, let it fall into all the recesses, and obviously not forgetting the other side as well. And then let that completely dry. Once you've let those other shades dry, we're going to move on to some highlighting, and the first highlight we're going to do is Pallid Witch Flesh, and this is just to pick out some of those nice raised details on the flesh areas of the model. So coming to the main body itself, we're going to pick out the bits that really stand out prominent, so the sort of raised parts of the skin around the vents on the head here, any sort of raised sort of harsh bits around the edges of arms and bits and pieces, anything that would sort of strongly catch the light as you're looking at the model. Now do take your time and try and be as neat as possible, just to try and pick out these lines. We're not looking to coat all over the skin by any means, just picking out those few details that we want to stand out from the rest of the skin. Once you're happy with how that skin looks, we can move on to highlighting up the purple now, and this is the 3 highlight stage, and we are going to start off with a highlight of Xeros Purple, and this is to sort of start off the feathering effect over all of the armour. So the way to do this is have a nice sort of fine tip brush, and then sort of start to draw sort of lines across the purple. This one they can be quite high or thicker lines if you want to, because they will get sort of narrower and shallower as we go with the different colours. But just work your way over all the different purple areas, so not forgetting the pads over the knees and the head crest and these little top bits here. Now also, when you come to do these top parts here with the vents, the way you want to do it is sort of come down from the top and sort of do it from feather from the top of the vent. So just sort of work your way down those, and then we can move on to the next colour. Once you're happy with that first highlight, we can then move on to the second highlight for the purple, and for this we're going to use Gene Stealer Purple. And it's very similar to how we applied the Xeros purple. We're going to do sort of small lines over the armour, but this time sort of keeping it a little bit closer to the sort of base of each of the sort of armour platings, and keeping nice neat lines as best you can to go across. Now this does take a little bit of practice to get used to. It's certainly not a technique that I picked up straight away, and you do have to sort of fine tune it a little bit sort of going forward. Obviously it depends how thick you want the lines to be. You can obviously have it depending on what sort of scheme you're going for, but obviously just take your time and keep going at it until you're happy. Once you've finished that second highlight, we're going to move on to the third and final highlight for the purple, and that is Slanesh Grey. And this is just to pick out all the sharpest edges of the model, as well as a very fine feather over the armour panelling. So just very small thin lines over the top of that armour, just to tie those other two colours together and give that armour a final sort of brightness towards the very end of each of the slats. So just very gently work your way around those, and then once you've done that bit, as I said before, obviously just a sort of edge highlight to all the sort of sharpest edges, so the tops of the vents here, obviously the smaller, some more curved ones, and around the edges of each of the panels as well, so around the bottom part here, and working your way around. So obviously not forgetting to do all of this to the gun as well, but take your time, work your way around, and then we can move on to highlighting up that red detail. Once you're happy with that purple highlight, we're going to move on to highlighting that red. And the first highlight we're going to use is Evil Sun's Scarlet. And now this is where we primarily focus on the weapon of the model, as it is predominantly red in colour. But obviously these highlights will also apply to the hoofs and claws of the main miniature as well. So with this Evil Sun Scarlet, we're just going to be picking out those highest and raised edges of the model, the ones we want to stand out and be sort of brighter from the darkest areas. So sort of looking at the model, just pick out any of those raised areas that you want to be more prominent, as well as any sort of sharp edges and corners of the as well as any sharp edges and corners of any of the claws or talons sticking out. Once you're happy with that Evil Sun Scarlet, we're going to move on to the second red highlight, and for this we're going to use Wild Rider Red. And instead of coating all of the areas, all the prominent areas like we did with Evil Sun Scarlet, we're just going to pick out a few of the most sort of highlighted and prominent areas. So any sort of main ridges that connect together. So there's these sort of higher dots here, for instance, the edges of the sort of cap to the gun, and there's a sort of point here that sort of runs across the top. So just sort of carefully work your way around. Obviously again, apply these to all the sort of claws and the feet of the model as well, and really you can add as much or as little of these particular highlights as you wish. The obviously the main body of the highlighting being picked up by the Evil Sun Scarlet, but these just sort of help add a little bit more transition and tonnage to the model as you're painting. So no under obligation to have to add these. The obviously the bulk of the work has already been done to the miniature. Next up, once you're happy with that Wild Rider red, we're going to move on to Troll Slayer orange, and this is just for the very sort of fine tip and sharpest edges of the model. So in particular the sort of claw on the front of the weapon here, just sort of coming down just a fraction of the way, just to pick out that really sharp edge and point towards the nib. Secondly as well, the actual sort of front tip to the weapon itself, where the projectile would be coming from, just to make that really stand out and pop from the rest of the miniature. And then as a final highlight to the miniature, we're going to do a little bit of Fire Dragon Bright, and this is just for those little orbs that we've painted already in the orange and yellow on the weapon itself. So really just sort of focusing on one part of the orb and not sort of covering the whole part, but maybe just the top, or you can come up from the bottom, whichever one you prefer. Obviously from here you can see I'm sort of coming down from the top and just sort of giving it a nice sort of coatage, and again on the larger orb as well, just sort of coming in just to add a little bit of extra gradient and tone to that yellow, blending it in a little bit further with the red. So obviously not forgetting to do that on both sides. Once you've finished all those highlights, the next thing to do is to put the models together if you went for the sub-assembly method, and also base them in whichever way sort of best fits in with the rest of your army. And there we have a finished Barbgaunt ready to take to the battlefield. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please leave a like and subscribe for more content, because I have got some more videos coming out and we've got a nice little sort of backlog coming so far. But any questions, just leave them below and I'll be happy to come back to you. Look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thank you.